She was 22 years old, newly widowed by a fever that had taken her husband of 14 months, and cast out of the only home she had known in Callow Bend, Arkansas, by a mother-in-law whose grief had curdled overnight into something that looked and functioned exactly like hatred, directed not at the disease that had killed her son, but at the young woman he had left behind, as though Della Voss had somehow brought the sickness with her in her trousseau and deployed it at the moment most convenient for her own survival. She had $8.40. She had a wool coat, a sewing kit, a cast-iron skillet that had been her own mother's, and the particular variety of dignity that belongs to people who have been publicly humiliated and have refused to let it finish them. What she did not have was a roof, and it was October, and the nights in the hill country of western Arkansas in October have a way of reminding a person of that deficiency with considerable insistence. The Smokehouse sat at the back edge of a property on the Callow Bend road that nobody had maintained for going on 9 years, a low, round-topped structure of hand-fitted stone, its wooden door rotted half away, its single iron hook still hanging from the ridgeline inside. The Patton family who had owned it had moved north after the old man died, and the property had passed through 2 sets of creditors without ever finding a buyer willing to take on the land itself, though the Smokehouse, separated from the main parcel by a creek, had been offered on its own at the courthouse notice board for 2 years at a price that kept dropping by $1 every 6 months. It was listed that morning at $4. People said it was too small to use and too old to trust, and that the floor was nothing but packed salt and would never support anything worth building. People said a girl alone would be foolish to consider it. What nobody said, what nobody could have said, because nobody knew, was what lay beneath that packed salt floor, sealed and waiting in the dark of the earth, containing the answer to a wrong that had been done to an entire valley of people and had never been corrected. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Della Voss. If you have ever been pushed out of a place you thought was home and been forced to decide what you were made of without anyone watching, leave us a word in the comments, we keep every one of them. Della had been born in 1868 in a farmhouse 12 miles east of Callow Bend, the second of 4 children belonging to Rupert and Maren Solberg, who had come from Minnesota with strong hands, a Lutheran hymnal, and a practical philosophy about the relationship between hard work and dignity that could be summarized as follows: you did not complain about the weight of a thing while you were still capable of carrying it, and you did not set it down until you had carried it where it needed to go. This was not cruelty. It was the operating principle of people who understood that the frontier did not negotiate, and that self-pity was a luxury with a price nobody in their family could afford. Rupert Solberg was a carpenter and a farmer in roughly equal measure, and he had the gift, rare and genuinely useful, of being able to look at a broken or neglected thing and see with great clarity what it could become if someone applied attention and patience to it. He had bought a half-collapsed barn at public auction when Della was 6 and rebuilt it over the course of a summer, with his 2 oldest children serving as his apprentices. And by the time it was done, Della could identify every structural joint in a timber frame by name and understand why each one was cut the way it was. This was not a lesson her father had planned to give her. It was simply the natural consequence of having a curious child and a complicated project in the good sense not to send the child away when she came to watch. Maren Solberg's gift was different in kind but equal in utility. She had a memory for the spoken word that was almost architectural in its reliability. She could recall a conversation from 6 years prior with the same precision that her husband could recall the dimensions of a mortise joint. She remembered names, dates, agreements made in passing, prices quoted in general conversation, the content of letters read aloud at the post office, the specific language used in courthouse notices. In The years before Della could read with fluency, Marin had served as the family's legal memory, the one who could say with certainty what had been promised and by whom and under what conditions, a capacity that had saved the family from at least 2 creditor disputes and 1 boundary disagreement with a neighbor whose memory proved considerably more flexible than Marin's when tested in front of a witness. From her father, Della learned to look at broken things with generosity. From her mother, she learned to remember everything. These 2 inheritances would, in the fullness of time, prove to be the most valuable things Della Voss owned, more valuable than the cast-iron skillet, more valuable than the $8.40, more valuable than any object she could have named on the morning she walked out of her mother-in-law's house with her belongings in a flour sack and did not look back. She had learned to sew as well. From a neighbor woman named Cora Pittman, who ran a small alterations business out of her front parlor and who had taken a liking to Della in the years before her marriage and had taught her not only the practical stitches but the finer work, smocking, pleating, the kind of invisible mending that made a repaired garment look as though it had never been damaged. This skill had earned Della small amounts of money throughout her girlhood, and she had continued it in her marriage to Ward Voss, taking in work quietly and saving what she could in a tin box under the floorboard that his mother did not know about, which was how she had the $8.40 when she needed them most. Ward Voss had been a gentle and largely inoffensive young man who had loved Della in the uncomplicated, undramatic way that some people are capable of and which she had come to appreciate precisely because it asked nothing theatrical of her. He had worked his mother's farm and planned to inherit it and had spoken vaguely about expansion in a way that suggested hope without urgency. When the fever came in late August of 1890, it moved through him with a speed that allowed almost no preparation, and he was gone in 9 days, and what he left behind was a young wife his mother had never warmed to, and a farm his mother had never intended to share. Hester Voss was not a villain in the operatic sense. She was a woman in genuine grief who had decided, in the illogical arithmetic of loss, that the presence of her daughter-in-law in her house was an ongoing reminder of a happiness she no longer had access to, and that the most direct solution to this problem was to remove the reminder. She had legal standing to do so. The farm was in her name. Ward had meant to transfer a portion to Della but had not gotten around to it. He was 24 and healthy and there had seemed to be no urgency, and so when Hester told Della on a Thursday morning 2 weeks after Ward's burial that she had until the end of the week to remove herself and her belongings, Della had understood that the law was not on her side and that arguing would cost her more than it gained. She had taken her skillet and her coat and her sewing kit and the tin box from under the floorboard, and she had said goodbye to no one because there was no one in that house who wished to be said goodbye to, and she had walked out into the pale October morning with the hill country opening before her in its russet and amber and the smell of approaching cold in the air, and she had allowed herself exactly 1 mile of genuine despair before she made herself think practically about what came next. She had no family within reasonable distance. Her parents had moved to Missouri 3 years prior, following her father's bad winter with his lungs, and the distance was too great and the cost too high for her to consider reaching them as a first move. She needed shelter within days, not weeks. She needed something she could actually buy with what she had. She had heard about the Smokehouse from an older woman at the dry goods store named Phoebe Alcott, who had mentioned it in passing as an example of the kind of thing that sat unclaimed in Callow Bend because nobody quite knew what to do with it. Phoebe had meant it as a curiosity, a piece of local color. Della had filed it in the part of her memory that her mother had Trained and left it there until Thursday morning, when she pulled it out. And looked at it with her father's eyes. Stone construction. She had said those words to herself as she walked. Stone construction holds heat. Stone construction does not rot. The man at the courthouse who handled property notices was named Birch Okafor, a quiet and unhurried clerk in his 50s who had the demeanor of a person who has witnessed every variety of human transaction and retained his equanimity throughout. He looked at Della when she came in. At her flour sack and her coat and her expression of composed determination, and he did not ask unnecessary questions. The patent. Smokehouse on the Creek Road, he said. $4 as of last posting. Smokehouse only, the land parcel is separate and not included. What does it sit on? Della asked. Legally, I mean. If the land isn't included. Perpetual easement for access and the footprint of the structure itself. It's an unusual arrangement, but it was the only way. The creditors could separate it from the main parcel. You'd own the building and have the right to use the ground under it and a path to the road. That's the sum of it. Who do I pay? He told her. She paid. He gave her a receipt and a key and the specific look of a man who hoped he was not watching a young woman make a serious mistake. The smokehouse was a 15-minute walk from the courthouse, and she made it in the long slant of afternoon light with the hills going copper around her and the creek audible before she could see it. The structure was perhaps 12 feet in diameter and 8 feet tall at its peak, built of flat creek stone fitted with the kind of patient, interlocking care that suggested whoever had built it had either loved the work or understood that it would need to outlast them. The door frame was intact even where the wooden door itself had given way, and the iron hook in the ridgeline was solid. She checked it by hanging her full weight from it, which was something her father had taught her to do with any hardware before trusting it. The floor was, as advertised, packed salt. Years of salt from years of curing, a compressed, crystalline white-gray surface that was as hard as stone under her boot and gave off a faint mineral smell that was not unpleasant, something between the sea and cold weather. She crouched and pressed her palm to it. It was cold and absolutely dry. Nothing grew in salt. Nothing rotted. It was, she thought, the most sterile floor she had ever touched, and in a structure that would be her home through an Arkansas winter, that was not the worst thing. She spent the first evening rehanging a door she built from timber salvaged from the fallen fence along the creek bank, rough work but solid, her father's lessons coming back to her through her hands. She had a candle stub. She had the skillet. She had a bedroll she had thought to take from the Voss farmhouse on her way out, one of the small practical foresights that grief does not always leave room for, but that Della had managed anyway. On the second morning she began, out of the habit her mother had given her and the restlessness that comes with having no other occupation, to clean the smokehouse thoroughly. She swept the walls with a straw bundle. She cleared the debris from the corners. She examined the mortar between the stones and found it sound except in two places near the base, where water had worked at it, and she mixed a patch from clay and creek sand and pressed it in with her thumb. She was on her knees at the eastern side of the floor, working at a section where the salt had heaved slightly, a small ridge, barely an inch, running in a line that did not match the natural settling she would have expected, when her finger found the edge. It was a board. Narrow, perhaps 6 inches wide, running beneath the salt. She had not been looking for it, and she might not have found it if the salt hadn't heaved just there. And later she would think. About that, about the way certain things seem to present themselves. Only to the person who is paying close enough attention and who is not. Too proud to get on their knees and look. She worked carefully, using a flat iron rod she had found among the debris in the corner, pressing along the line of the board until she found its boundary. 3 boards, it turned out, each about 4 feet long, arranged side by side to form a rough square roughly 2 feet across. The salt above them was compacted and old, a layer years thick, and she had to work for the better part of an hour with the iron rod in her hands before the first board came free with a sound like a slow exhale. Beneath the boards was a cedar box, sealed with pitch around its edges, a careful, deliberate waterproofing job, and wrapped again in oilcloth that had kept it from the moisture of the earth around it. The box was perhaps 18 inches long, 10 inches wide, and 6 inches deep, and it was heavier than it looked when she lifted it out, heavy in the particular dense way of something that contains many pieces of paper. She brought it to the doorway where the light was better. She worked the pitch seal loose with the iron rod. She opened it. Inside, layered in order and separated by cloth, were documents. Dozens of them. Land surveys, payment receipts, letters, a bound ledger, and at the very bottom, in an envelope sealed not with pitch but with red wax pressed with a thumb, a letter addressed in a hand that had clearly belonged to someone accustomed to writing with precision, for whoever finds this after me. There is a wrong here that the law can still correct, if someone will carry it. The name on the inside of the letter was Cornelius Patton, the old man who had built the smokehouse, who had owned the farm, who had died and whose family had gone north. But the letter was not his confession. It was his evidence. Della read it once, quickly, in the doorway light. Then she read it again, slowly, with the attention her mother had trained into her, parsing each sentence for what it said precisely and what it implied and what it would mean to someone reading it without knowing the history of Callow Bend. Cornelius Patton had been, in the years before his death, the informal record-keeper for a loose association of small farmers in the Callow Bend Valley, about 30 families who had come together in 1878 to form what they called the Bend Cooperative, pooling resources to buy seed and equipment at better prices than any of them could negotiate alone. They had contributed money, kept accounts, and elected a treasurer from among themselves, a man named Garfield Hume, who ran the general store and was considered, by virtue of his position and his manner, to be a man of reliable honesty. Garfield Hume had been stealing from them since the cooperative's second year. Not dramatically. Not in large amounts at any one time. He had done it the way a certain kind of thief prefers to operate, in the margins, in the rounding, in the small discrepancies between what was recorded in the cooperative's ledger and what was recorded in his private accounts. Over 12 years, the difference amounted to something in the range of $2,400, drawn from 30 families, each of whom had lost enough to matter but not quite enough to trigger the kind of suspicious scrutiny that a larger theft might have invited. Cornelius Patton had discovered it the way Della's mother might have discovered it, through memory. He had been present at meetings going back to the founding, and he had a habit of making his own notes in a small memorandum book, not for any official purpose but simply because he was a man who liked to know where things stood. At some point in the late 1880s he had begun to notice that the totals Hume reported at meetings did not match the totals Cornelius remembered from the previous meeting. And the differences were always in Hume's favor. He had spent 2 years building the case. Carefully and quietly, collecting documents, receipts that cooperative Members had given him to hold copies of letters, the cooperative's own bound ledger which he had obtained on the pretext of reviewing it for his own records and had never returned. He had written to a lawyer in Little Rock who had confirmed that what he was describing constituted criminal fraud and that the documentation he had assembled was likely sufficient for prosecution. And then his heart had given out in the spring of 1890, before he could act on any of it, and his family had packed up and left, and nobody had thought to ask why the old man had sealed a cedar box under the salt floor of the smokehouse he had built with his own hands. The ledger in the box was Hume's private account book, the one that showed what he had actually received and what he had recorded in the cooperative's books. Side by side, in Cornelius Patten's careful annotations, the discrepancies were devastating and entirely clear. Garfield Hume still ran the general store. The cooperative had dissolved some years back for reasons nobody could quite articulate, feeling of diminishing returns, a vague dissatisfaction that nobody had been able to pin to a cause. The 30 families were still in the valley, most of them, older and smaller and no wealthier than they had been. Hume had built a second building behind the store that year. He had a new wagon. He was, by the standards of Callow Bend, prosperous. Della Voss knew what it felt like to have something taken from her by a person with the patience to wait for a legal moment. She knew what it felt like to be told that the law was on someone else's side and that there was nothing to be done. She had walked out of Hester Voss's house with that knowledge still fresh in her chest. And she carried it carefully as she carried the cedar box to the office of the county attorney on a Tuesday morning in early November, dressed in her best mended clothes and carrying the box wrapped in clean cloth under her arm. The county attorney was a man named Aldrich Pruitt, who was cautious by temperament and not inclined to move quickly on anything, particularly anything that involved a young woman he did not know. Presenting a cedar box and a claim about a well-regarded local businessman, he received Della with the particular courtesy of someone who has already decided to be skeptical but is too professional to show it immediately. She laid the documents out in the order Cornelius Patten had arranged them, and she walked Pruitt through them the way her mother would have walked through a conversation she had memorized. Methodically, without drama, letting the material make the argument. When she was finished, the attorney sat for a while without speaking. "Where did you come by these?" he finally asked. She told him precisely and factually, the smokehouse, the heaved salt floor, the sealed cedar box, the letter addressed to whoever found it. She had anticipated the question and she had her receipt from Birch Okafor in her coat pocket, which she produced, proof that she was the legal owner of the structure. And had been at the time of the discovery. "If I were to send an examiner to verify this box was found where you say it was found," Pruitt said carefully, "what would they find?" "The hole under the salt floor, the 3 boards, and the outline of the box's impression in the earth," Della said. "And perhaps my knee prints, where I was working." He sent the examiner. What the examiner found was exactly what Della had described. Garfield Hume was a man who had spent 12 years believing himself safe. He had watched Cornelius Patten's farm clear out after the old man died. Had driven past the smokehouse periodically in the years since and observed its quiet disrepair, had watched it remain unsold and unloved and had experienced, each time, the particular relief of a man who has buried something dangerous and watched the grass grow over it. He was not prepared for the morning that Aldrich Pruitt walked into his general store with a deputy and a warrant, and the expression on his face as he looked at the paperwork, that specific, airless expression of a man who has just understood that the thing he believed he had buried permanently was, in fact, still present, was observed by 3 people in the store at the time and described afterward in essentially the same terms by all 3 of them. The case took 8 months to complete. Hume's private accounts, once subpoenaed, confirmed everything in Cornelius Patton's ledger. The restitution ordered by the court was partial. Hume had spent a portion of the money, and what remained in his accounts fell short of the full amount, but the court also ordered the sale of the new building behind his store, and with that added, 23 of the 30 cooperative families received meaningful payments that none of them had expected to see. The Bend Cooperative reformed the following spring, this time with a formal accounting structure and 2 signatories required on every disbursement. They asked Della to serve as their record keeper, a position she accepted with the specific quiet satisfaction of someone who has been handed exactly the work they were built for. She was still living in the smokehouse, which she had improved considerably over the winter, a proper floor laid over the now empty earth. A second room framed out against the south wall using creek timber and stone she quarried herself from the hillside behind the structure. It was small and it was hers, and it smelled of mineral earth and pine resin and the particular cleanliness of a space that had been cared for by someone with genuine attention. Hester Voss, it was noted by those who kept track of such things, lost 2 farm hands the following spring who had heard about Della's circumstances and decided they preferred to work for people with different values. She managed, as people like Hester generally do manage, but in a smaller way, with a smaller compass, in a silence that was the silence of someone who has learned to stop certain kinds of expectations. Della did not attend to this. She had other things to attend to. We began with a young woman standing on a road in October, cast out of a house that had briefly been her home by a grief that had nowhere else to go, with $8.40 and a cast-iron skillet in her mother's particular gift for remembering what had been said and by whom, and under what conditions. We began with a smokehouse that everyone had passed for 9 years without stopping, a salt floor that looked like a dead end, and a woman that the world had temporarily misplaced and not yet found again. We did not tell you then what we can tell you now, that the thing Della Voss possessed that could not be taken from her by any legal document or any grief-sharpened mother-in-law was the ability to get on her knees in the cold and press her palm to the floor and feel, with hands trained to notice the difference between a thing that is settled and a thing that is merely waiting, that something beneath the surface was not done yet. Cornelius Patton had built his evidence in secret and buried it in darkness because the world he lived in had not yet given him the moment to bring it into light. Della Voss found it. Because she was paying attention, because she was low enough to the ground to feel the edge of a board beneath a year's worth of compressed salt, and because she had been raised to believe that broken and neglected things deserved a second look before you decided they had nothing left to offer. The smokehouse still stands at the bend in the creek road outside Callow Bend, Arkansas. The floor is plank now, and there is a second room that catches the afternoon sun. The hole under the old salt is filled and sealed, but Della knew where it was for the rest of her life, and she thought about it on difficult days, not with sentiment exactly, but with the practical gratitude of a woman who understands that the thing that saved her was not luck, and was not magic, but was the willingness to sweep the floor clean and see what the sweeping turned up. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the whole story. Thank you so much for watching, and for spending this time with Della. And with the people of Callow Bend. If this story found you at a moment when you needed it, we would be grateful if you passed it along to someone else who might need it too, someone building something small from not very much, or someone who has recently been told that what they have left is not enough. Before you go, we have one question we would love to leave with you. Has there ever been a moment in your life when getting low to the ground, when slowing down and paying close attention to something everyone else had written off, revealed something that changed everything? We would genuinely love to read your answer in the comments. Until next time, stay close.